Still waiting for a few key people, such as my board chair, people like that. So Jessica and Heather, I will introduce you in just a moment or two. Welcome, Tim. I just texted you. I'm delighted to see you joining us. So Jessica and Heather, you probably know Tim Leahy already, the chair of our board. It's wonderful that he has so much expertise in the field of preservation. Well, good afternoon, everybody. We are recording this webinar, so we'll be able to share it with others who aren't able to join us while it's going on. And I also wanted to note that I collected some questions for Jessica when we held our last meeting. And I already shared them with her. So she has some questions in mind that she knows that our group would like to ask. As we get started, I wanted to welcome everyone to this wonderful workshop about the National Register process in Maryland, graciously agreed to by Jessica French, who is Administrator of Survey and Registration at the Maryland Historical Trust. And joining us as well is Heather Barrett, who's the Administrator of Architectural Research at the Maryland Historical Trust. And they work together on administering the National Register program, and they have cumulatively, they have a great deal of experience in administering this program, and as do, I think, some of our participants who have developed National Register nominations or who are looking at them. So with that said, and with acknowledgement of all of the positive efforts that have been made to date on behalf of our Chesapeake Crossroads African American Preservation Committee and their interest in creating more nominations and enabling the fact that more African American properties and communities in Maryland would be able to take advantage of being on the National Register. So welcome, and we'll start with you, Jessica.
Hi, thank you. As Carol said, I'm Jessica French, the Administrator of Evaluation and Registration at the Maryland Historical Trust, the state's Historic Preservation Office, or SHPO. We're charged with preserving and interpreting the legacy of Maryland's past. MHT began as a nonprofit in 1961 with the National Historic Preservation Act of 1966. Each state was required to establish a SHPO that would carry out the federal preservation programs such as Section 106, which is review and compliance, and the National Register of Historic Places. Through Medusa, MHT's online cultural database, users can explore properties included in the Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties, which is maintained by MHT, and those properties and districts listed in the National Register of Historic Places maintained by the National Park Service. Everything listed on the National Register in Maryland is also on the Maryland Register, and there's no separate process for properties to be added to the Maryland Register. It's everything National Register in Maryland is Maryland Register. MHT has a robust architectural survey program. The state is well known for its comprehensive approach to survey. Survey is the process of identifying and gathering data on a community's historic resources. It lays the groundwork for many other types of preservation activities, such as National Register nominations. To plan for, protect, and interpret historic places, the first step is to understand and document what you have. The Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties, our state inventory, includes over 45,000 standing structures, which includes districts, and 15,000 archaeological sites. The inventory is primarily for research and documentation purposes and is one of the methods used to document Maryland's historic resources. The National Register of Historic Places recognizes districts, buildings, structures, objects, and sites for their significance in American history, archaeology, architecture, engineering, or culture, and identifies them as worthy of preservation. The National Register is a program of the Department of the Interior, the National Park Service, and is administered at the state level by us, MHT. The National Register in Maryland currently comprises close to 1,600 listings, which includes some 200 historic districts. Counting all the contributing properties within those listings, the register covers more than 100,000 properties in the state. And this year we've had 2 new listings so far, with several pending at the Park Service. So we add register listings probably in the area of 15 to 20 per year, depending on the year, some more, some less. And so this number increases all the time. To search for information about properties that are already listed on the National Register, you can search our National Register database or Medusa. From the NR database, you can browse listings by county, see a list of all National Register districts, or you can search by name, location, or keyword. Or you can look at our list of multiple property submissions. Through Medusa, you can also search by address, and that gets you all, you can limit your search just to National Register properties, or you can also see what's in the Maryland Inventory of Historic Places and see what else, what other information we might have on a property you're interested in. And all National Register nominations are scanned and available as PDFs through the database search or through Medusa. So what are the benefits of listing in the National Register? It could be the official recognition of the property's significance. It's the threshold for financial incentives for preservation, including tax credits or some of our grant programs, and consideration in planning for state and federal projects. And I know we had a question about eligibility for MHT's capital grant program. And for that, you could be individually listed in the National Register, a contributing property to the National Register listed district, or you can be determined eligible in either of those categories. And so to get a determination of eligibility, the first step in the process is usually to contact the capital grant staff, and they'll gather a little bit more information about your type of project, the property in question, including asking for any current photos and any historical information you may have. And then they forward that on to me, and I look and see what we might have in the MIHP or other sources of information. And I usually give preliminary determinations of eligibility. So those are for the grant program only, but and if you want to pursue actual listing, you'll have to go through the steps to make a National Register process. But the preliminary determination of eligibility sort of is that first gathering step and is a way to be eligible for grants without an official nomination. does the National Register restrict property owners? And the answer to that is no. Instead of restrictions, the program utilizes incentives. So if grant money or tax credits are used for a project, the project must follow the Secretary of Interior standards for the treatment of historic properties, which are best practices for treating historic buildings and structures. And then, but generally, restrictions or control only comes at the local level in the form of preservation ordinances, zoning overlays, or other types of local decision making. Listed properties can span a wide variety of types and periods, ranging from prehistoric archaeological sites to buildings of the recent past, and include rural landscapes, urban and suburban neighborhoods, bridges, sailing vessels, and more. The National Register divides resources into 5 broad categories: buildings, which are pretty self-explanatory, structures, which include bridges, tunnels, dams, roadways, and also some agricultural structures like corn cribs or silos that are meant more for storage than for human habitation. Sites can include gardens, battlefields, design landscapes, or archaeological resources like funerary sites. Objects can be sculptures, monuments, boundary markers. In some cases, small boats can also be objects. And then districts. Those can be residential, commercial, or in some cases a mix. There we have large urban districts on the register in Maryland, like those found in Baltimore or Annapolis, or they can be rural historic districts like Lower Deer Creek Valley in Hartford County, which contains early industrial sites like grist mills and paper mills, along with other small farmsteads throughout. So what makes a property eligible? So to be eligible, a property must demonstrate significance at the local, state, or national level. And there's 4 broad criteria it can fall under: events or trends in history, association with individuals who made a demonstrable and lasting contribution, architectural merit, or the potential to yield information that will contribute to a better understanding of our past. And the property must also retain physical integrity to reflect the significance. Only one criteria needs to be met to be listed, but often many properties will fall under more than one eligible criteria. So the first criteria is criterion A, and that's events or trends in history. To be considered for listing under criterion a property must be associated with one or more events important in a defined historic context. Criterion A recognizes properties associated with single events or a pattern of events, repeated activities, or trends. So here, Mount Airy, or the Grove Farm in Sharpsburg, was listed on the National Register in 1986. And it's a good example of a property associated with a specific event, the Battle of Antietam. The house was used as a hospital for Confederate and Union soldiers following the battle. And on October 3rd, 1862, President Lincoln and General George McClellan visited Mount Airy, an event recorded photographically by Alexander Gardner. So there's one specific event that the property is associated with. The other way is, under criterion A, is to be associated with more of a general trend in history. So Schifferstadt and Frederick was nominated to the National Register in 1974 and later became a National Historic Landmark. And one of the criteria it meets is criterion A for its association with German immigration and settlement in colonial America. The property shows the close relationship of the early German settlement of the region with the German traditions that are still in evidence today. And so there's extensive amount of architectural detail and hardware showing German influence, which is, and it rises to the level of outstanding significance, as it's unusual in other spots in Maryland. Criterion B is association with persons. And so it's officially defined in the bulletin as properties associated with individuals whose specific contributions to history can be identified and documented. Persons significant in our past refers to individuals whose activities are demonstrably important within a local, state, or national context. And so this is the Hans Schuler Studio and Residence in Baltimore. and it's significant for its association with the sculptor Hans Schuler. The studio is one of the few buildings from the early 20th century that was specifically designed as a private artist studio, and he was one of Baltimore's most sought-after sculptors, receiving numerous commissions from private individuals, corporations, and civic groups, and his work spanned a broad range of types, including monumentals, groups, tomb figures, architectural ornament, commemorative medallions, and coins. And so to be associated with a person, the property should be most closely associated with that person's productive life. So that's the property that showcases where he did his work, which is what he's known for. Criterion C for architecture applies to properties significant for their physical design or construction. They must embody distinctive characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, represent the work of a master, possess high artistic value, or for a district, represent a significant and distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction, but together recognize a broader a group, as a group work together. And so Whitehall is sort of an example on top of a high style architecture, a 5-part German house. But then you can also see a Rosenwald school, which is an example of a school type that's important to history. The slave house at Sodderly is important for a specific type of construction method that was once common, but is now rare to find. And then row house is typical of something that even though they're individually very repetitive and similar, become a district in the register's eyes and represent significance in that fashion. And criterion D information is usually reserved for archaeological properties, and criterion D has 2 requirements. The property must have or have had information to contribute to our understanding of human history or prehistory. And the second requirement is that that information must be considered important. So the first step in evaluating a property for the National Register is to research and establish describe the historic context. Context can vary with resources. Properties may reflect multiple contexts, but this establishing the historic context early on allows for comparisons among similar resources, understanding the relative importance of a property, and it gives you a chance to evaluate the property in a local, state, or national context. Then defining the period of significance is an important next step. That's the length of time when a property was associated with the important events, activities, or persons, or attained the characteristics which qualify it for the National Register. So it can be the time when the event occurred, the span of time when the property was part of a trend, time the property was associated with a person, or the date of construction of a property. And once the historic context and period of significance is established for property, the next step is assessing integrity. So to be eligible for listing, the property must also retain physical integrity to reflect significance. So the National Register defines 7 aspects of integrity to evaluate for properties. Their location, what's the place where the historic property was constructed or the place where the historic event occurred. Design, the combination of elements that create the form, plan, space, structure, or style of a property. Setting, the physical environment. Materials, the physical elements that go into a property. Workmanship, the evidence of crafts of a particular culture or people during any given period in history or prehistory. Feeling, a property's expression of the aesthetic or historic sense of a particular time period. And association, what's the direct link between an important historic event or person. So not every property needs to have all 7 aspects of integrity to be eligible. The criteria the property is listed under and its period of significance will help determine which aspects of integrity are most important when you evaluate a resource. So the essential physical features. So it helps to define what makes the property significant, what defines the character or appearance during the period of significance. Has it been significantly altered since the event took place? Would an individual associated with the property recognize it today? Does a property significant for its architecture retain the characteristic features of its style, period, or method of construction? Do archaeological sites remain undisturbed so that in the future people can research and discover answers to important research questions? And for a district to retain integrity as a whole, the majority of its components must possess integrity, and the relationship among the components must be substantially unchanged. So some examples, a building nominated for architecture would need to retain integrity of design, materials, and workmanship, but in some cases, a building can be moved and still be nominated if the thing it's being nominated for are its construction methods, which are still evident. Oops, excuse me. Agricultural properties generally should have a high degree of integrity of setting. The rural character of them should remain. And so another example here would be the Lula G. Scott Community Center, which consists of two Rosenwald schools that were joined together with additions in the 1950s. The period of significance in this nomination was defined as 1921 to 1958, beginning when the Churchton School was built and ended after the school was moved to the Shadyside Rosenwald School site in 1953, and two additions were made, resulting in its current configuration. So even though this involves a moved property and some additions, both schools have really good exterior integrity. They really look like Rosenwald schools. If someone were to visit from the past, you would recognize it immediately. It's got the same general form, massing. So even though there have been changes, it's got good integrity. So ordinarily, the register does not consider cemeteries, birthplaces or graves, religious properties, moved structures, reconstructed historic buildings, commemorative properties, or properties that are less than 50 years old as eligible for the National Register. Those are generally ineligible as a rule. However, there are 7 criterion considerations that make exceptions to those rules. So criterion consideration A takes into account religious properties, and a religious property can be eligible if it derives its primary significance from architectural or artistic distinction or historical importance. So basically anything that's not directly connected to its religious significance could be argued that makes it an important property that could be nominated. Criterion consideration B is for moved buildings, and a property removed from its original or historically significant location can be eligible if it's significant primarily for architectural value, or it is the surviving property most importantly associated with a historic person or event. Criterion consideration C takes into consideration birthplaces and graves, and a birthplace or grave of a historical figure is eligible if the person is of outstanding importance and if there is no other appropriate site or building directly associated with his or her productive life. Criterion consideration D is for cemeteries, and a cemetery can be eligible if it derives its primary significance from graves of persons of transcendent importance, from age, from distinctive design features, or from association with historic events. And cemeteries can also be eligible if they contribute to the significance of a building or district. So for example, a church nominated under criterion A may also have an associated cemetery that's listed as a contributing resource to the property. And the same in a historic district. If there's a big historic district that includes a cemetery, the cemetery can be eligible as a contributing to the district. Generally not on its own though. Criterion consideration E takes into account reconstructed properties, and that can be eligible if accurately executed in a suitable environment and presented in a dignified manner as part of a restoration master plan, and when no other building or structure with the same associations has survived. And for commemorative properties such as monuments, it can be eligible if design, age, tradition, or symbolic value has invested with it its own historic significance. And finally, properties less than 50 years old can be nominated if the significance of the property is exceptionally important. So how to list a property in Maryland? So for timing, generally it takes, for an individual property, it can take between 9 and 12 months from the very beginning of the project to official listing on the National Register to finish. And districts or other complex properties can take a little longer. So the first step is to contact our office, and I'll generally make a preliminary determination if the property is eligible, and I can make a site visit if necessary, can help find comparable nominations or examples to get started. And then the next step is to prepare the draft nomination, and MHT does typically advise using a professional preparer, especially for a district or a site that is complex, has multiple buildings or multiple elements. Generally, section 7, the architectural description, and for districts, the contributing, non-contributing list are the parts that can be challenging. Generally, most people can put together a section 8, the statement of significance, well, especially heritage groups that are interested in history and are good, already have a knowledge base and people interested in researching. But for districts, the maps and other pieces of the technical pieces of the nomination are the places where it can be a little tricky. NPS's Bulletin 15, how to apply the National Register criteria for evaluation, and 16A, how to complete the National Register registration form, can guide this process if a professional preparer is not used. And MHT also has guidance in Chapter 5 of our standards and guidelines for architectural survey that sort of help people walk through what's expected of a nomination and how to fill out the various sections. And if a property is eligible under an existing multiple property submission, that can make the nomination process a little bit easier because the historic context is already defined and the registration requirements are also outlined. So it helps making the integrity assessments and those sorts of things a little easier. After the nomination is prepared, MHT will comment on the draft, make any suggestions for revisions to help make sure that it's the best document it can be. And once it's ready, it's scheduled for a governor's consulting commission or the GCC Maryland State Review Board. That board meets in February, May, and October. And the deadline to get a nomination on the agenda is generally 90 days before the meeting. And that just makes sure that we're able to meet our property owner notification guidelines and other procedural steps as outlined in the regulations that govern the National Register program. So at the GCC meeting, the property is presented and the board makes a recommendation on whether to move the nomination forward or not. And once the nomination is approved by the GCC, MHT has 90 days to forward it to the National Park Service. Sometimes the GCC might ask for some revisions of a nomination before it moves forward. And usually all nominations need a final technical check before they go to NPS. But once the nomination gets to NPS, they have 45 days to take action on the nomination, either to list it or to return it to us, because they either think the nomination needs revisions or they say, no, we don't believe it's eligible. And generally when nominations go through the GCC, they fare pretty well because the staff wants to make sure that the nominations are in the best shape possible. But even if the GCC turns down a nomination, generally they will make suggestions on how to revise to make it viable. They're wanting to see things listed just like us. So here are some helpful links. The first has all of the various NPS publications that guide the National Register program, all of the bulletins, plus they have a bunch of white papers, best practices, and other updates that are useful in preparing nominations. Our standards and guidelines is the next link down. And again, that just has the Maryland specific guidelines for National Register submissions, which is more, and it's more of the procedural things like how to submit a nomination to me and how the GCC works and things like that. And then finally, MHT's National Register database. And then I can turn it over to Heather for her portion. She can talk about funding for nominations.
Hi, everyone. I'm Heather Barrett. As Carol mentioned, I'm the Administrator of Architectural Research. I believe I met or worked with 5 of you. So it's good to see everybody. And I just want to give you a very brief overview on the non-capital program. This is the best way, in my opinion, out of our grant programs to fund architectural survey work, National Register nominations, and historic context. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the program. It's designed for research, survey, planning, and educational activities involving architectural, archaeological, or cultural resources of Maryland. So we do both fund projects involving buildings and those involving archaeology. The funds are distributed by the Maryland Heritage Areas Authority Financing Fund, so thank you. Eligible applicants include nonprofit organizations. This does include state and federal agencies, as well as local jurisdictions. Local governments must provide a one-to-one match. This can be a combination of cash or in-kind services. No percentage is assigned to those categories, so it can be, the contribution can be made up of either of those. There is no match required for a nonprofit organization, but providing one makes you more competitive. This is a highly competitive grant program. And so that assists in boosting your application. And so the eligible activities include architectural and archaeological survey work, National Register nominations, historic structures reports, thematic research, so the production of multiple property documentation forms or simple research reports. We fund preservation plans and then a variety of education and outreach activities related to preservation. There's a whole long list of the projects that we'll fund in our grants manual and guidelines, and that's available on our website. So it really gives a detailed look at the program. So if you're interested in applying, make sure you check out that document. Next, Jessica. And so coming up, we will open this next grant round in May. For the past several years, we've had $300,000 to disperse. The cap for projects is at $75,000. We have yet to fund a project that high. They range anywhere from, I'll say, $6,000 to about $55,000 is what we've have funded over the past couple of years. It's a two-step application process. So what you're looking at is a very simple intent to apply form, and that's essentially a 2-pager. And those are usually due in June or July. We'll set those dates here soon. And then the complete application, which is much more detailed, look at your scope of work and your budget. That's usually due around August 1st. And then decisions are made. We have a staff panel that reviews the applications and ranks them. Then they're presented to our board of trustees. And so then that decision is set forward to our secretary for approval. And then we lost Jessica, I believe, and maybe the
no.
presentation. So let me regroup here.
Oh, she's back. She's connecting.
Okay. Just to give you a sense of what we dealt with last year is for FY23, we had 23 applications. I believe we funded 11 of those. And the total amount requested was nearly $1 million. So you can see that it's we have $300,000, but yet we're receiving applications for nearly $1 million. So that gives you a sense of kind of the program. We do workshops, both much more extensive look at the program virtually. And then we have had in-person workshops in the past too. So stay tuned about that program in May. But it's an excellent way to fund the type of work that we've talked about today. And actually the ladies from Lindra and Faye are involved in Columbia Beach Historic District nomination that is being funded through our non-capital program. So that's an example. And with that, Jessica, do you have our contact information or we can send it out to folks?
So let me try to share again. I'm sorry that my Zoom closed.
And we can talk to you a little bit about the costs we've been seeing for either survey work or nomination work. But again, if you're looking to hire a consultant, this is a good way to go. So there's our contact information, and you can drop us an email at any time with questions about the register or the non-capital grant program or the survey program. And with that, we can open it up to questions if you might have some.
I guess I have a question to start off, and then other people can put their hand up with that little signal that they have their hand. And I see Tony already has one. But my initial thought was that people could perhaps do some of the nomination themselves, but then as one of you mentioned, I think it was Jessica, there are some more technical sections. So they could possibly say, identify that they needed help with the technical sections and the attachments such as a map. Do you ever see that coming in?
So I don't know that I've seen it myself, but Heather might have more thoughts about that. But I think it is a possibility to try to work out with a consultant parts of the work that you can do and parts that they would do.
So I have seen it done successfully, where, as Jessica mentioned, the Section 8 in particular is, assisted by volunteers or people with an interest in the property. We're doing a non-capital grant in Frederick County right now. They've hired a professional consultant to do the survey work. Some of the research is being done by volunteers. Some of it is being done through an archaeological firm. Sometimes we have mixed results, but there are certainly examples where it has been done successfully, where you're kind of all pooling your resources together, and with people's expertise, that's pulls together the product. Columbia Beach is even an example where Lindra is going to be doing the oral histories, which will then feed into the context Section 8 of the nomination. So it's those kinds of partnerships. You need to look carefully at kind of everybody's capabilities and what they're interested in and things like that, but it is doable.
Okay, I'll call on Tony, who's got his hand raised.
Yes, hello there. How are you? Okay, so I was on the I chaired the Maryland Heritage Area Authority. I guess it was a grants committee a couple of years ago. And as I see your last, I think it was like a log, built out of logs just now. It's like a pavilion outside. How old was that pavilion, and how did that qualify for your grant?
Are you talking about the pavilion that was in one of the slides?
Yes.
So that is a CCC structure, one of the pavilions, and I don't remember which park it's at, but it's at one of our state parks.
Okay.
And that actually, I believe the consultant deemed that eligible. But that was a big that was part of a large survey project.
Okay.
So they were producing Maryland inventory forms. And some of the parks were looked at as historic districts. Some of the structures were looked at individually.
Okay. I grew up Hall United Methodist Church in Glen Burnie on Solid Road, and we had on one side of the church Rosenwald School, Marley Neck Rosenwald School, and the other side was the church hall. And since that time, many years ago, the church hall was torn down. But what if the footprint of that foundation was still there? That still qualified it to be raised again and get a grant for that? Does that make sense?
So you're saying to reconstruct it?
Yes.
So the non-capital program doesn't, one of the activities that is not eligible is bricks and mortar projects. So where some of our other programs, particularly the heritage areas, you know, as far as reconstruction or even new construction, we do not fund that under the non-capital program.
Okay. Thanks very much.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I see that Tim's hand is raised also.
Yes, hi everybody. How you doing? I'm sorry I was having trouble getting my video to start earlier, so I'm sorry I was a little late. But thanks very much, Heather and Jessica. One thing, Jessica, if you could give us those sections again, it's several slides back, maybe just even one slide or a few slides back, there was maybe it's one slide forward, it had the websites, and then you mentioned some chapter numbers. Yeah, I think there, you said we should go to certain chapters in there to look for more guidance or more specifics. If you could just repeat those, that would be great.
Sure. So the middle link, the standards and guidelines for architectural and historical investigations in Maryland. So chapter 5 is the National Register guidance.
Super.
But we actually, that chapter refers to other chapters in that document as well. So the whole thing is worth a read.
Okay.
And then the first NPS link, the two for preparing nominations, probably the two most important are Bulletin 15 and Bulletin 16A. But that has their whole list of publications related to the National Register program, and all of them can be useful depending on what your project is. So yeah, so
Thanks.
that's a good link.
Thanks. I'm sure I could have figured that out, but I appreciate your
No,
guiding us right
fine.
to them. There's so many. But so thanks again for the presentation. There does seem like a lot of opportunity to analyze and help sites fit themselves into some of the multiple criteria, and you don't have to qualify for everything. So that's really good news, I think. I did have a specific question about the difference between locations and sites where structures may not exist, but it's a known structure that was demolished. And there may or may not be evidence of a foundation. So I can't remember early on the exact site, the word site, location, say that there is local knowledge and history, documented history of what was there. It's not a graveyard, and it might not be so can a site without a structure be eligible for nomination?
It's possible. It might have to qualify under criterion D as an archaeological site. So then there might need to be some limited testing to see what is there that could yield the potential for information.
Okay, so it's okay. Yeah, that makes sense. It seems like I have one more. And it sounds like cemeteries, if they're adjacent or associated with a structure, are also possible as contributing, but probably not standalone. Is that what I?
Yeah, if the building is eligible for the register and there's an associated cemetery, then yes, the cemetery can kind of get in as being part of the whole complex. But yeah, cemeteries are tricky because it's, there's some limited exceptions to get them on the register.
Yeah.
But
so that. And of course, all this, I guess, over time, you probably see many more nominations and possibly think, how much leeway do you have in terms of these determinations versus what the National Register? I guess how much flexibility as a Maryland do you have versus what you really have to toe the line with the National Register? I know that's not a yes or no question. I don't want to put you on the spot. I'm just curious about how you negotiate that balance or that concept.
So ultimately, to get listed, the National Register program has to approve the nomination. The keeper has to sign it. So in general, we need to follow the bulletins as outlined. However, the National Register program itself is trying to expand and be more inclusive. Okay. They're working on editing all of the National Register guidance. So starting with the traditional cultural places bulletin, to change it, to update it so that it's in plain language, so it makes it more clear what's eligible and not eligible. And from the webinar I attended on that, they're looking to do that with all the National Register bulletins to make sure that the program continues to be viable and popular in the future. Yeah. So I think if we make a good argument, we can argue our case as best as we can to make the nominations as solid as possible, but it is ultimately up to the Park Service about what's eligible and not eligible when it comes to the formal listing.
Yeah, and one kind of final, or just one more question, and I'll let everyone else talk. But so you can be listed. So you mentioned that all National Register projects are on the Maryland Register. Is there anything like you're on a Maryland Register that's maybe, I don't know how to say it, but didn't quite make the cut, but still as deemed important to be on a Maryland Register? Or is it just kind of, you're still eligible until, and you're still in process? So, and what's the status of that kind of structure?
So we don't really have a separate Maryland Register. Everything that's on the National Register in Maryland is on the Maryland Register. We don't have kind of an in-between step.
Okay.
But things, there are some things that have been determined eligible through, for example, compliance projects that aren't officially listed, but we do have determinations of eligibility on file for. So there's that, those properties can be a little bit of an in-between, but no, we don't have a separate state program that really that registers properties.
Okay, and I know I said that was the last question, but but the terminology of the old MIHP, Maryland Inventory of Historic Properties, which I was used to, is the same thing as the Maryland Register. Is that correct?
No,
they're different. Yeah, so the inventory is basically for research and documentation purposes. It is not considered a listing.
Okay.
So it doesn't bestow any designation if you're included. It's really for research and documentation.
So it's great to have as a library of content that may be useful later, but it doesn't designate. Okay, that's really helpful because it's easy to understand that.
And I was going to just add, some counties use it a little bit as a flag, to say
Right.
there's something here, something of historic interest here. But really, people get confused that it's considered a listed
Yeah.
property or a designated property, and it isn't.
Yeah. Is it helpful in grant applications if you're in that inventory?
It's helpful in that it supplies kind of a framework to work from.
Mhm.
So it, for other purposes, an inventory form can be a first step to a register nomination. So you're still collecting a lot of the same information. It really, Maryland's inventory form is similar to a nomination in
Mhm.
that there's that main section 7, which is the architectural description, and then the section 8, which is the history.
Yeah.
So it gives you a leg up.
Yeah, that's where I was going with it. I was hoping that was the answer. And in order to start that process, do we also contact Jessica's office or you or?
You can
Where-
contact me, or you can
Okay.
contact Allison Lutheran, who is our architectural survey administrator.
Okay,
So
so it's really
either she or I can help you with that.
Okay.
So
Thanks.
I have a kind of a two-part question back in the day, we were looking at everything in the heritage area that was on the National Register, and some were boats, and we looked into them. They no longer exist. Is there a way that things are taken off of the National Register once they are on it?
Yes, so properties can be delisted. So if the big way is if a property is demolished. So we document that and send it up to the Park Service, and they certify that our information is correct. You can also technically change a building so much that it would no longer be considered eligible, but those types of delistings are pretty rare. And in the case of boats, those are interesting because they move, and so properties that move, we would also send an amendment up to the Park Service to say, hey, this boat used to dock here, but now it docks somewhere else. So yeah, all of those types of actions can be documented and sent up to the National Register to make sure that the information is correct.
So the second part of my question has to do with a community that I believe they felt like they were being considered to be possibly delisted. Is this a real phenomenon?
Heather, you might have some background on this. I would say it's rare. I don't think it happens very often that communities are delisted. I feel like it happens maybe more on a local level when there's zoning ordinances involved. They can reevaluate their resources more frequently than we do for the National Register. But yeah, it's pretty rare for a property to be officially delisted.
Thank you. So I'm looking around the Zoom. Are there some other questions for our experts? I guess my other question would be about integrity. That's the gray area question, right? Like Rosenwald schools that have been modified. How far is the modification? And we talked to a Rosenwald school recently. I believe they felt like they might want to take off the siding and things and make it look more like its original state.
So Rosenwald schools are an interesting case because we have the multiple property submission, which defines the registration requirements, and the integrity standards for those are pretty well. They're well defined, but they're not tight, I would say, in that I think for the Rosenwald schools of Maryland, it says it doesn't, Rosenwald schools don't have to have their original bank of windows. You just need to be able to see on the structure where the windows were. So even if some of them were covered up, if it's kind of obvious where the original windows were, it counts. So for a Rosenwald school, I would take a look at the multiple property submission carefully, because it does define it. It's less, when you use a multiple property submission, in some ways it's less gray because it writes it down, but then you know what you're working with.
So I think we've talked to a group that in the multiple property nomination, it says that the school doesn't exist anymore, but yet it does. So is that a strike against it?
No, I mean, the register does know that mistakes can happen. So that's something, if they did want to pursue listing, we could always just make a note when it gets sent up that it was thought that it wasn't there anymore, but here it is, we identified it.
Great.
I'll just add, there's something called additional documentation that, things that need to be corrected through the register can be sent up if there's egregious errors.
Well, I'm looking around the Zoom again to see if someone wants to add a question from the group.
Actually, one more. Just again, if I'm in a group designation, like in the Rosenwald schools, when I'm applying, again, this probably, and I want to be individually listed, does that help me with the grant process that I'm individually listed? And I guess this is all helping people to make better projects and better grant applications. Would it be desirable to go for an individual designation if you were already in a multiple, or is it really adequate to be in the multiple listing? I know that's a judgment call. Again, I don't want to put you in a yes or no, but.
Jessica, do you want to take that, or do you want me to?
Oh, sure. So for multiple property submissions, properties are not actually listed until they do an individual nomination under the listing. But for the capital grants program, I don't believe they take into account individual listing versus eligible for their ranking. But in the AHP program, and this is something to check with the grant staff on that side, but I believe that in the AHP program, you don't have to be National Register listing, or even eligibility is not, you don't need that to apply, but then individual listing does get you slightly more credit for the grant application. So it sort of depends on your grant program and stuff that can be talked out with the grant staff, I think, more.
And AHP was what? I'm sorry.
The African American
Gotcha.
Heritage Preservation Grants.
Got it.
Okay, so Tony's hand is raised.
Yeah, I'm back with Hall United Methodist Church. This show Hall was Hall Methodist Episcopal Church, and a guy named John Henry Hall, his son William Halls, and his wife donated the land for Hall to build the church. But where the initial property where they did their bush church back in the woods, they had a very large sandstone. I guess maybe 6 feet of it was out of the ground, and the rest was in the ground. On the top of that, they carved JHH for John Henry Hall. On the very top of it, front of it had a cross. Now, new community was built. Superintendent protected the rock and had it moved from the new community behind Hall United Methodist Church. Is it possible to get a grant to make a memorial garden around that rock and have a plaque put in the community where it originally was? That's a lot.
That's a lot. So again, for the non-capital program, that would not be an eligible activity, but you could talk to some of the other grant programs that we have here at the trust to see if it would be eligible under their grants guidelines.
Sure.
And I can send, or you can just do a search on the Maryland Historical Trust funding opportunities.
Okay.
And then you'll see a variety of grants that are available. And some of ours, like, so non-capital is basically research and documentation. But some of them do allow for new construction or construction activities. So you just have to take a look at each grant program to see what we fund.
Sure.
And actually, I'll put in a plug. At the beginning of May, we're doing something called the MHT Roadshow. And there's going to be a variety of our grant programs, financial incentives survey. So this is going to be a big workshop that will encompass kind of all of our programs that will give a brief overview. So that might be a good time for you to tune in to see kind of what various opportunities are.
Okay. I will bring someone from Hall United Methodist Church. Can people who are not on here right now, can we bring other folks who their properties will be affected by this conversation?
Sure. So the workshop is going to be available to the public. So that check our website, and we can send some information directly to Carol, and she can just distribute that if that would be helpful.
It will be. Thank you very much.
Sure.
So I have a question having to do with my confusion about districts that are so much bigger, and what's mentioned, I guess, is contributing and non-contributing. Are there lists? Are there specific lists like these things are contributing?
Yes, so the nomination will have a contributing, non-contributing list, and basically it's based on a survey of the district, every single property in it. And basically what's considered non-contributing would be things built after the period of significance. So, if the period of significance goes, like, say, to 1950, anything built after 1950 wouldn't contribute. That would be non-contributing. And then things built before 1950, but that maybe are so altered that they don't have their historic appearance anymore, those might also be considered non-contributing, depending on, and that depends on how the nomination defines what criterion it's nominated under and sort of what's the important historic context. But depending, it goes district to district, but all district nominations now have a contributing, non-contributing list and a map that also shows that in a geographic way.
And do they all appear on Medusa? Does Medusa have everything? Like, if you click all around?
Yeah, Medusa has all our National Register listings. And then depending on when all the nominations are scanned, but depending on when the nomination was prepared, some of those really early nominations prepared when the program was just beginning in the 1970s don't necessarily have all the same documentation that we would have today. So some would be missing some pieces, but generally everything's on Medusa. And even for the National Register, some stuff is in our files but not scanned, just because of how documentation was produced. So some of our oversized maps weren't scanned and put on Medusa, but we have copies here too that I can always look for in our hard copy files. But generally, for the National Register program, it's pretty comprehensive, and everything in the MHP is also on Medusa.
Yeah, I can attest to that. I've been spending a lot of time on it recently, and it's really worked. Medusa has been a success. So congratulations to all of you. I know it was a long time getting there, but I can be helpful to anyone in our group that wants to. And they overlay, the color schemes are very clear, and you can tell if it's got multiple things about multiple aspects to it. You can click them on and off and filter. And so it really is easy to use, I think. And just another question about districts. It kind of sounds like a district is a way, it's almost like a group designation. It circles a series of structures or places, and then things become eligible because they're within that boundary. But they have to be documented as contributing to have any emphasis. Okay, and that's where it gets into getting professional help in doing that, I think. Okay.
If you weren't considered contributing at the beginning, is that ever the case that was an oversight and you could get yourself recognized as contributing?
Yeah, so I mean, when you're dealing with that 50-year rule, you know, and we have early districts that were done in the 70s or 80s, and the consultant was looking at that harsh 50-year rule, you know, sometimes things from the 30s weren't even looked at. So things do need to be reevaluated periodically with that in mind.
Well, that's very interesting. So I'm looking around the Zoom again. Do I have other questions? Lindra.
Hi, Heather and Jessica. It's great seeing you all.
Good to see
I've been
you.
looking forward to this opportunity. And thank you so much for a wonderful presentation. And I want to thank Carl again for making it all happen. I have two things. One, I just want to share for those that have not gotten started on the nomination process. I want to reiterate something that you all said earlier, and that is teaming. It is very important to pull a solid team together because we all don't know everything. And so working with the Columbia Beach group, it has been very helpful to work with the community, especially the community historians. Faye and I have met several times since you all came out to meet with us initially, and the information is growing. There's a lot I would not have known about Columbia Beach, especially because I don't live there, but you have people that have knowledge of the beginnings to present, and that is very important. While my role is to conduct or interviews, it is very important to talk to the community and try to get not only the history, but who are the right people to interview. So that was a very important comment that you all made. The second thing that I wanted to ask is with the properties that's not listed or hasn't been fully scanned, is it possible to come to MHT to do some research?
Yes, so MHT has a library. I can share our librarian Laura Westwood's contact information in the chat in a minute. But we do have a big library. We have vertical files, which are newspaper clippings sometimes, and other information on a range of buildings. We have architectural drawings, and we have a big library of books that include local histories that may be hard to find other places. So yes, coming to MHT to research is good because you might find something.
Okay, thank you. The other project, as you know, I'm working on is the Rosenwald Schools. For instance, we're finding very little information on Skidmore, and I was wondering if that's, you know, one of the schools that you may have information on that hasn't been released to the public.
We can certainly check to see if we have any additional information. And you've seen the latest Rosenwald School MPDF and
Mhm.
the ones Susan Pearl put together.
Mhm.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
those are great resources. And I would say also check with the county
Mhm.
because they have, they have their own set of files.
Yes, we've
there-
done that, and I've spent several
Yeah.
days there, so I receive a wealth of documentation and photos
Right.
from the county.
Yeah.
I'm trying to think. The Susan Pearl. Very familiar with that because I assisted her in
Oh,
that
good.
project. Yeah,
Good.
so I have
Yeah, that's
lots
a great
of information.
document.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'll check to see if we have anything else here that,
Okay.
that we can uncover.
Okay, thank you.
So I see that Laura Westwood's contact information is here in the chat. Again, I think for all of us, thank you so much for this presentation. We're delighted that this could happen and that it was able to be recorded and it can be shared with so many additional people.
That's what I was thinking too, Carol, that we can replay this and it clears up a lot of questions. That we just, it's great to talk to the experts. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your time and for your expertise. We
Thanks
appreciate
for
it.
having us.
Yes,
Thank
thank
you.
you so much.
And it's good to see you, Heather.
Yeah, good to see all of you.
Wonderful.
Yeah, take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.